Okay. So you know how a lot of you have told us that like improving your English speaking skills can sometimes feel like this huge, overwhelming thing like climbing a mountain? Well, today we're taking a deep dive into a method from our source material that's called the Power Hour. It's basically a way to break down that mountain climb into like manageable daily steps with the potential for some really surprising results.
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting about this power hour idea is that it's all about just like 1 hour of focused practice every single day. And according to our material, that alone, that 1 hour can lead to some pretty big breakthroughs in like how fluently you speak, how clearly you speak, and just your overall confidence when you're speaking English. And what I think is really empowering is you don't need to sign up for any expensive courses, or you don't even need to like find a language partner to do this.
So it's kind of like taking control of your own learning.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Exactly.
Okay, so this Power Hour has 5 key steps. Each one is like carved out with a specific amount of time. So the first 10 minutes are all about listen and absorb. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's involved in this first stage?
Sure. So this first part, it's all about immersing yourself in the sounds of English. Think of it like letting your ears just soak up the language. Our sources suggest things like you can listen to podcasts, audiobooks, news reports, basically anything where you can hear native speakers talking in a natural way. And what's really fascinating is that even if you don't consciously understand every single word that's being said, this kind of passive exposure is still super beneficial.
So there's no pressure to like understand everything perfectly right from the start.
Exactly. The idea, as the material points out, is that your brain is still working in the background, even if you're not consciously translating every word. It's getting a feel for the rhythm, the intonation, the way words are connected. And over time, with this repeated listening, it actually trains your ear to recognize sounds and patterns, like in a really deep way, almost like building this intuition for the language from the ground up.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's encouraging to hear that because, sometimes when you're learning a language and you feel like, oh, I'm not getting every word, it can be a little discouraging. But it sounds like even if you don't feel like you're actively grasping everything, you're still making progress.
Absolutely.
So are there different ways to approach this, listen and absorb, depending on like what level you're at?
Yeah, definitely. So for beginners, our sources recommend using materials that have subtitles. So you're basically seeing the words as you're hearing them, and that can really help to make those connections. But for more advanced learners, they suggest trying to listen without subtitles to really challenge your comprehension and just to kind of sharpen your listening focus.
Okay, that makes sense. So you've got like a progression there.
Yeah.
So after those first 10 minutes of listening, we move on to the read and repeat stage. So this is another 10 minutes. How does this step build upon that first step of listen and absorb?
So this stage takes things a step further by combining visual input with speaking out loud. So you choose some English text to read. It could be anything from a news article to a short story, even subtitles from like a video you've been watching. And then you read it out loud. And what's really cool is that you're engaging both your brain through reading and your mouth through speaking at the same time.
So you're kind of doing two things at once.
Exactly.
But reading out loud, it seems pretty straightforward. But why is it considered such a valuable part of this process?
Well, the material highlights how the actual physical act of saying the words out loud, it helps to kind of solidify those neural connections in your brain, almost like exercising the muscles in your tongue and mouth to actually produce those specific sounds of English correctly. So you're building that motor skill. And then there's also this added bonus of, a boost in confidence that comes from just hearing yourself speak English, even if you're just reading someone else's words.
So it's not just about the mental side of understanding the language, it's about the physical act of producing the sounds as well.
Exactly.
And I imagine that there are some people out there who, they'll come across words that they have a hard time pronouncing. Are there any suggestions for dealing with that?
Yeah, and this is a really practical tip from our sources. You can use text-to-speech tools to hear a native speaker clearly pronounce those tricky words and then try to say them yourself. Or if you're reading subtitles from a video, you can really pay close attention to how the speakers are articulating those challenging words and then try to mimic that. It's about getting that clear sound in your mind first.
Okay, so we've immersed ourselves in listening. We've engaged our reading and speaking by reading out loud. And now we get to a stage that I think a lot of people who are learning a language might find a little bit nerve-wracking. Speaking. Practice. No fear. So this is 15 minutes where you're actually speaking.
Yeah, and it's totally normal to feel a little hesitant about this step, especially if you don't have a lot of opportunities to regularly talk with native English speakers. But, our sources emphasize that this step is super important for taking all that passive and semi-active learning and turning it into actual active communication.
I mean, I can see how that would be kind of a big hurdle to get over.
Yeah, definitely.
So the material addresses that very common concern of not having anyone to talk to. And the suggestion is to actually talk to yourself, which, I think if someone told me to do that, I might feel a little strange about it. But are there actually tangible benefits to doing that?
Yeah, I think it's a totally natural reaction to think, oh, that's weird. But our sources are really strong advocates for talking to yourself. And here's why: it creates a completely judgment-free zone where you can just focus on expressing your thoughts in English without any fear of making mistakes in front of someone else. And they even suggest practicing in front of a mirror.
That's interesting, talking to yourself in the mirror. So it's not just about the words themselves, but it's also about how you present yourself, how you use body language.
Exactly. Communication involves so much more than just vocabulary and grammar. You've got your facial expressions, your gestures, all those nonverbal cues. And practicing in the mirror lets you become more aware of those aspects of how you communicate. And in terms of topics, our sources suggest keeping things practical, like describe your day yesterday or talk about what you're planning to do today, or even dive into like a hobby or something you're passionate about. The point is to just keep talking.
Okay. And what's really important if you stumble on a word is to try to explain it in English instead of switching back to your native language.
Yeah, that's super important. It forces you to think in English to kind of find those workarounds and alternative ways to express what you're trying to say.
Right. So it's about problem solving in English
Yeah.
rather than relying on your native language as a crutch.
Yeah, exactly. And another tip is to record yourself speaking.
I was going to say that. I was going to say, okay, so you're talking to yourself in the mirror. How about recording it too?
Exactly. And I know it can feel awkward to listen to yourself, but it's so valuable to hear yourself objectively. You might notice things like where your pronunciation is a bit unclear or where you hesitate or places where you could be smoother. And it's also great for tracking your progress over time so you can actually hear the improvements.
Yeah, you can listen back to like a recording from a few months ago and see how far you've come. That's pretty cool.
Absolutely.
All right, so after that 15 minutes of speaking practice, the power hour moves into vocabulary expansion for 10 minutes. So building up your vocabulary is something that I think pretty much every language learner focuses on. What's the recommended approach here?
So the emphasis here is not on memorizing tons of random words. Our sources say that building your vocabulary should be practical and relevant to your learning. So what they suggest is that you pick 5 to 10 new words or phrases that you came across during the listening and reading parts of your power hour.
So you're kind of pulling from what you've already encountered.
Yeah, exactly. So you write those words down, you look up their meanings to make sure you fully understand them, and then this is the really important part, you use those words in your own sentences. And our sources point out that it's really common for language learners to just passively memorize words without ever using them, but that's not effective. You really have to use it or you lose it.
Yeah, I mean, just because you know the dictionary definition doesn't mean you're actually comfortable using that word in conversation.
Right, exactly.
Is there any kind of tip to help make those new words stick in your mind?
Yeah, the sources talk about something called the keyword method. It's basically creating a strong mental image or association for the new word. Like you can think of a vivid picture or a personal connection or even a strong emotion that you associate with that word. That way it's kind of like a hook in your mind to help you remember it later.
Oh, that's interesting. So you're kind of creating a story around the word.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we're almost to the end of our power hour. The last 15 minutes are dedicated to something called the shadowing technique. Can you explain what that is and how it works?
Sure. So shadowing is a really effective method for improving your pronunciation, your intonation, and just your overall fluency. Basically, you listen to a short audio or video clip. It could be a TED Talk, a piece of an interview, a short news segment, anything like that. And you try to repeat exactly what the speaker is saying at the same time. Like their shadow, you're echoing them, you're sticking as closely as possible to how they're speaking.
So it's not just about understanding the words, but it's also about mimicking their style of speaking.
Yeah, exactly. So you're really paying close attention to how they're pronouncing each sound, how their sentences flow together naturally, and how their voice rises and falls. It's a very immersive way to train your mouth and your ears to work together, and it helps you internalize the natural patterns of spoken English without you even really thinking about it. Our sources suggest that this technique can really help you start to sound more like a native speaker without having to constantly think about every single grammar rule or word choice.
So it's like a shortcut to sounding more natural.
Exactly.
Is there a good way to get started with shadowing if it seems like a little bit too much?
Yeah, the sources recommend starting with audio or video that's spoken at a slower, clearer pace. Once you get comfortable shadowing at that speed, then you can gradually challenge yourself with content that's spoken at a more natural, faster conversational speed. That way you're building up your reflexes and your ability to keep up with natural speech.
That makes sense. So that's the core of the Power Hour. Listen, read and repeat, speak, build vocabulary, and shadow. It seems like a really well-rounded approach that you can fit into an hour each day.
Mm-hmm.
But, the material doesn't stop there. It also talks about how to make this a sustainable habit, right? The make it fun section.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Consistency is key for any kind of language learning, and our sources offer some great tips for keeping your Power Hour engaging over the long term. One of the biggest things is to choose materials that you're actually interested in, whether that's sports, music, technology, travel, whatever you're passionate about. Because when you're engaged with the content, the learning becomes so much more enjoyable and relevant.
It's like anything else. If you're not interested, you're not going to stick with them.
Exactly.
So are there any other suggestions for keeping the Power Hour fun?
Yeah, they suggest joining online speaking groups. It's a great way to connect with other learners, get some real-world practice in a supportive environment, and just feel like you're part of a community. Also, setting goals for yourself, like learning a certain number of new words each week, or being able to shadow a particular type of audio that can give you a sense of progress and accomplishment. And another really important tip is to track your progress in a journal or something similar, and then celebrate those small wins along the way to keep your motivation up.
So it's like a combination of structure and also like a positive mindset.
Exactly. And in the end, the biggest takeaway is just showing up consistently, right?
Yeah. I mean, even if you miss a day, it's not the end of the world. You just pick up where you left off.
Right, exactly. Don't get discouraged. The more you practice, the easier it gets. And our sources really emphasize that.
So just to recap, this Power Hour method is a 60-minute daily routine that focuses on 5 main areas: listening comprehension, reading aloud speaking practice, vocabulary building, and the shadowing technique. And according to our sources, if you do this consistently, you can see some pretty amazing improvements in your fluency, your pronunciation, and just your overall confidence when you're speaking English. And all of that without needing any kind of formal classroom instruction or even a language partner.
Yeah, it's all about empowering you to take charge of your own learning.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive into the Power Hour. It's a really interesting way to look at how to improve your English speaking skills, and breaking it down into these manageable steps makes it feel so much less daunting.
Yeah, I agree. And what I think is really effective is how active this method is. It's not just about sitting back and absorbing information. It's about actively engaging with the language in different ways within that hour.
Yeah, it's like a full workout for your English skills.
It-
So for those of you listening, think about this. How could dedicating just one focused hour each day change your relationship with the English language? What part of this Power Hour routine really speaks to you? Or maybe what seems like the biggest challenge to actually incorporate into your own learning? It's definitely something to consider as you continue on your English learning journey. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks, everyone.